So Anya mentioned a lot of interesting topics this morning, like AI, and design systems, and I will not be talking about any of those things. As Anya said, there were a lot of companies that she named: Google, Microsoft, IBM. I'm not from any of those companies. I run a small design firm in the Washington, D.C. area called 8 Shapes, and I've been thinking about user experience design for a long time. So she did say there were some experienced older people here. That is the demographic that I fill. So I wrote 2 books. One called Communicating Design was my first book. It was about documentation, how we communicate our design ideas with each other. The second book I wrote is called Designing Together, and it's how we collaborate and communicate or deal with conflict in the design process. So you can see that I like to think about what you might call the dirty underbelly of design. And that brought me to my most recent book, which is called Practical Design Discovery. And this is, in this book, I was trying to answer the question, where does the design process start? How do we get started? When I started thinking about this, I wanted to define what do we mean by discovery? What does that word mean? We've all sort of say we've got a discovery phase or we have a discovery process. And so I came up with this definition of discovery. Basically, the idea is that it's a set of activities that we use to create some shared knowledge that helps us structure and inform our design decisions about whatever product that we're working on. But even coming up with that definition, I realized, well, what do we mean by activities? What kinds of activities are we talking about? And what is the knowledge that we need to create that we need? And what are these decisions that we're talking about? Well, we can look at these things like design processes. This is kind of an abstracted view of the double diamond, which is one way of describing the discovery or the design process. And what I don't like about these models is that they don't take into account what we know about how people create things, right? Creativity, innovation is not a linear process. In fact, we kind of bounce around a lot. We think we make different connections in different ways. So I came up with a model that entails kind of these different quadrants and helps us understand why we do the things that we do, right? So why do you create a set of personas? And why do you conduct research? And why do you do usability testing? And why do you build a prototype? I think in our field, we haven't done a good job of answering those questions for ourselves each and every time we do the process. But in trying to understand why, we can also help us understand how. Like what should I do next? How do I make these decisions? What I've come to learn is that there is no really perfect linear process for how we do design. There's no perfect arc that we can go through. That, in fact, creativity requires us to sort of constantly shift where we are and where we're going. I call this course correction, right? Okay, I've made some decisions now, and now I've learned something new. So I need to make a different decision now. I need to go in a slightly different direction from the one I expected. This may be different from what you learned in school or what you've experienced at work, where you're trying to create a repeatable process. I'm arguing that creativity doesn't lend itself to a repeatable process. But how do we make these course corrections now? How do we make these decisions? How do we integrate our experience into the process of deciding which way to go in the design process? And that brings me to mindset. Mindset is a decision-making, a cognitive mechanism that we use to make decisions. It's a way that we might perceive the world, understand what's going on in the world, and then make a choice as to how to act. So perception is, what did I observe? understanding is, how does this relate to me? And choosing is, what am I going to do about it? So like I said, mindset is this cognitive mechanism that we use to understand the world around us, understand the situation that we're in, and then make a choice about which way to go. So let me give you an example of mindset in action. In this case, maybe I've received an email from my manager, and it's terse. Have you ever gotten a terse email from your manager? I don't believe you. You have definitely gotten a terse email from your manager. Obviously, she's really mad at me, right, because it's so terse. If she was happy with me, she would include a lot of flowery language that tells me how great I am. And so my next step here is, obviously, I'm going to explain why I did what I did. I'm going to give her a lot of detailed explanation, and it will not come across as defensive. I'm confident of it. All right, so this is mindset in action. It's observing something in the world, understanding how it relates to me, and then making a choice as to how I'm going to act. Pro tip, a 6-paragraph email is never the way to act. So how does this relate to discovery? Well, in discovery, we're starting from scratch, or we're starting from a very little amount of information, right? So your perception is, I have gaps in my knowledge. I can't make all the design decisions that I need to make. So I must fill the gaps in my knowledge. And so I'm just going to take a bunch of wild guesses, right? No. What I'm going to do about it is I'm going to do things, I'm going to engage in activities that help me increase my knowledge, right? I've perceived the gaps, I understand why I need to fill those gaps, and then I'm going to take steps to fill those gaps. How does this relate to user experience? Well, we're encountering different kinds of challenges in UX all the time. So for example, the products that I'm working on, and probably the products that you are working on, are getting more and more complex. They're getting harder and harder for us to solve these problems. So by perceiving the interdependencies in these products and recognizing that I am incapable of understanding or seeing all of these interdependencies means that I need to make a choice on how I'm going to deal with that. And maybe I pull other people into that process. We've also got new media that we're dealing with all the time, new kinds of devices, new screen sizes, new everything. We're dealing with novelty all the time. I perceive that something is new. I'm not aware of all the things that I could do with this. And so I need to relax some of my assumptions and preconceptions about what's happening, the experience that I've had, so that I can apply new ways of looking at these media. And we're also working with more and more people, right? When I got started in this business, dinosaurs still roamed the earth, and we were just sitting alone in our cubes kind of doing HTML, right? That is not what's happening anymore. We are collaborating more and more with different kinds of disciplines and different people. So I understand that there are lots of people involved in this project, and that everyone is capable of adding value, and that I need to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, right, and assume that they are going to add value to this project. We can also think about how mindset relates to the techniques that we use in user experience. So critique is a really good one. Critique can be challenging for us to deal with. If you've ever had someone criticize work that you're doing, it can be very painful. So for example, I often feel like my colleagues are threatened by my good ideas. And obviously, whoever wins gets promoted. So I'm going to attack them when they come at me with their good ideas. No, obviously, these are terrible, terrible advice. Take a picture of the screen now that I've crossed everything out. All right, so how does this work really? I perceive that my colleagues are actually trying to help me improve, and that I understand that we're on the same team and that we have the same goals, even though we might have a different perception of the right way to go. And so I'm going to listen to what they have to say and not take their critique personally, but I will take their critique personally. But this is a growth opportunity, right? All right, by interpretation here, I mean like we've observed a usability test, and we all have a different interpretation of what we saw in that usability test. So I'm going to say, like, my colleagues have a different interpretation of what happened, that it conflicts with my own interpretation, and they have interesting, unique perspectives that might yield meaningful and useful insights, and I'm going to ignore everything they say because they're clearly wrong. No. Obviously, I'm going to have a conversation with them and discuss the interpretations, and we've got to integrate time for that in our processes now. A lot of this thinking of mine comes from Mindset by Dweck. Dweck was is a psychologist at Stanford, and she's actually studying something completely different from creativity. She's trying to answer the question, why do smart kids not try new things? And maybe you've experienced this in your own life or with yourself or a loved one, obviously not you. But if you're someone who's been told that you're smart, you may be reluctant to try something new. My canonical example of this is my older son, who's a very bright child. He was reading fluently at age 3. He has read the Lords of the Rings series twice. He's 13 years old. Whenever we ask him to practice piano, he throws a tantrum, right? Because it doesn't come naturally to him like other things do. And so why is he so resistant to this? She came up with this contrast between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. With a fixed mindset, which is what Harry, my son, experiences when he's asked to practice piano. Not anymore, he's gotten a lot better. This challenge is difficult for me without any, right? So I'm perceiving I've got a challenge in front of me and it's hard for me to do. If I get this wrong, people will think I'm stupid. And therefore, I'm not gonna even try because it challenges my self-identity. And this is why we often struggle to engage in new things. She contrasts this with a growth mindset, same perception. This challenge, this is difficult for me, and I need help. But you know what? If I get this wrong, so our perception is different. If I get this wrong, this will be good for me. I'll learn something new. So let's give it a try and see what happens, right? The mechanism works differently here. This was incredibly eye-opening for me, not just as a parent, but as a manager and as a designer, and really understanding how I approached different things, different aspects of the design process. But I felt like growth was kind of insufficient as a way of coaching designers on how to approach design problems. So I came up with these 3, what I call collaborative mindsets. I'm gonna go through these quickly because I've got 3 more mindsets that I need to get to. But with an adaptive mindset, the idea here is I perceive that what I'm doing isn't working, so I'm gonna make a choice to adopt a new approach, right? That I feel comfortable in changing my direction or changing the way I'm thinking about something. So the technique that I suggest here is change the technique, right? I'll give you an example. Let's say I budgeted to do usability testing with sort of live usability testing, in-person usability testing, but we decide that the usability testing is not appropriate for that. How am I going to change the technique? What can I still do with the time and the money that I have that is more appropriate for the project, right? So being able to make those changes on the fly rather than sticking with the recipe because that's the one that you have in front of you. So you're gonna see a bunch of these index cards on the screen. These are practical techniques. I understand that telling you to be more adaptive is not very helpful. I'm nothing if not pragmatic. So what I'm gonna give you is a handful of behaviors, things that you can try and do. And I promise you some of them will be uncomfortable for you. But that's the point, right? The whole point is we're gonna try some new habits to build up some of these mindsets. So the collective mindset says that it's better to involve more people in the process. And if you're a shy person like me, that can be incredibly intimidating and challenging. We did this once when we had done a bunch of user research and generated a lot of data, but it was too difficult for me to analyze that data by myself. So I drew other people into that process, right? I made a choice. I'm gonna draw other people into that process. So the challenge here, the habit to build, is engage multiple perspectives. So things that you might do solo normally, I challenge you to say, how can I bring other people into this process? The last collaborative mindset is called assertive, right? And the idea here is that you can be confident in stating your opinions. And again, this can be challenging and might make you uncomfortable even to think about doing this in some situations. One way to think about how to be assertive is that you need to be able to move forward even without a complete set of information. So the technique here is use your current knowledge. Like whatever you have in front of you, that's what you have in front of you, right? And so that's what you're gonna do in order to be assertive and move forward in this project rather than standing still, being static, getting stuck in the process. We can see all of these in action. 8Shapes, I mean, it's been a while now, but we adopted collaborative sketching workshop into our process. And so we were changing the technique. We had realized that we kept hitting a wall with our clients, not being involved enough in the design process. We knew that it would help us engage multiple perspectives, and it allowed us to kind of say, you know what, let's just put down on paper what we think the screen should be right now with the current knowledge, because that actually helped us understand what we needed to learn. Now, again, you might be looking at these things and thinking, new things make me scared, or I like working by myself. That's why I got into this business. Or authority figures scare me, right? You might be looking at this and thinking, I can't be any of those things, and I totally understand it because that is my reaction to these things as well. But I also acknowledge that it's important for us to try and overcome some of these things because that's how we grow as designers. We know design thrives when we can be adaptive, collective, and assertive. We know that design is better when we can do those things, but how do we accomplish those things? How do we do it? And that's why I've given you these habits to try and build up. With discomfort comes growth. That is the world that we live in. The other advantage to thinking about mindset in this way is that it gives us a chance to pause. And this can be a difficult skill to cultivate, but the idea here is like when you perceive something, you can ask yourself, wait, why am I feeling anxious right now? I don't know if you've ever done that in your life, but I was once on a call with my business partner and he was giving me some critique and I could just feel the bile rising. And I was like, whoa, Brown, why are you feeling like this right now? And it was really healthy because then I didn't sort of react immediately to the kind of feedback that he was giving me. We can also pause. Once we've come to an understanding of what's making us feel anxious, we can say, wait, but why did I interpret the situation this way? Why did I think he was trying to undermine me? And probably most powerfully, once we get to that choice of how we're gonna act, we can pause and we can say to ourselves, what would be a better course of action? What can I do to be more productive here? But even as I look at these three mindsets, I feel like this is not enough. This is all about collaboration. How do we deal with creativity? How do we make ourselves engage our creative selves better? And what I realized is that this discovery model relied on three other mindsets: curiosity, skepticism, and humility. With curiosity, the idea is that I'm excited to learn new things. And as I talked about in my workshop yesterday, sometimes it can be hard to get excited about what other people are worried about or thinking about. So with curiosity, we say to ourselves, there are gaps in my knowledge. We can't know everything, but I'm excited to learn as much as I can. And I'm gonna take the time to learn what I can about this domain. How can you cultivate this in yourself? Well, you can build up the habit of asking questions. A lot of the times as designers or consultants, we sort of find ourselves in the position of being able to provide the answer, right? To be the expert in the room. And sometimes it's better to quash that or put it aside for a moment and instead say, what can I ask about this so I can learn more about it? Another thing to do is to follow your hunches, right? Again, we sort of live in a world or we operate in a business climate where we need to be sort of very prescriptive, and we don't give ourselves an opportunity to follow some of the more interesting detours that might come out. We see that in critique, right? Where critique, when I'm giving criticism to someone about their work, I'm going to ask them questions about it rather than simply just saying what's right and what's wrong. But I can also encourage them to follow their hunches. This is not what I thought this was going to be. Why don't you pursue it a little bit more? All we're doing is sketching right now. In skepticism, we don't take all of our assertions at face value. So the mindset here is perceiving that some of our work depends on making assumptions, that making decisions based on faulty assumptions can be problematic. So I understand that if I make a bad decision, that can have bad consequences later. So let me focus on uncovering those assumptions now. How do we do this in practice? Well, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to do this, but just sometimes sitting down and thinking about what are all the underlying assumptions that I'm making here can be really helpful to call them out. Or when you're listening to someone else talk, you can write down some of the assumptions that they're making. Another thing that you can do here is play devil's advocate. Like, you know what, I totally agree with what you're saying, but let me just take the opposing point of view for now. Another thing that's not listed here, but that I do is, wait, let's slow down a little bit. And asking people to slow down and walk through their thinking more carefully can help you uncover some of the assumptions that they're making. We see this in doing interpretation of usability results. When you're kind of thinking through the things that you observed, you can ask yourself, wait, what do I need to assume in order to reach these conclusions? What are some of those underlying assumptions? And when you're hearing someone else describe their interpretations, you can say, you know what, I completely agree with what you're saying, but wait, let me just ask you some questions about this, or let me challenge some of those assumptions. Humility is the last one. It is the one I have the most trouble with. And with humility, the idea here is to basically embrace your ignorance, to understand that even though you perceive yourself to have some experience or expertise or gray hair in some of these domains, that you still have a lot that you can learn from it. Experience doesn't qualify you as an expert, right? And therefore, the choice that you can make is, how can I engage other people's perspectives? How can I learn from other people? So the technique here is to just simply say, I don't know. And sometimes it's hard for us to admit this, that you don't know something, but there's a lot of value in just simply saying, you know what, I don't know, I need some more time to figure it out, or I don't know, what do you think about this? And another thing that I've tried to cultivate in myself is to look at every experience as a learning opportunity. What am I going to learn from this? This is not my favorite project in the world, or this is not my favorite team in the world, or this is not my favorite domain to work in, but I know I'm going to learn something. What can I learn from this experience? Every time I sit down and do a sketching session, someone will challenge me on an idea that I have, and I'll simply say, I don't know. I don't know if this is the right way, or I don't know if this is appropriate for our target audience. Because for me, that sketching session, I'm always trying to get better at doing design, at presenting my ideas. So that's my shtick. Let me just summarize it for you. Discovery is not a phase. That is to say, we can talk about doing discovery as a phase at the beginning of a project, or we can talk about doing a discovery project. And by all means, that is how I make my bread and butter, right? That is how I sell my services. But I also understand that, to a certain extent, discovery is not just the set of activities, right? It's not just about conducting stakeholder interviews and doing user research and brainstorming. It's not just those things. That in fact, we need to be thinking of discovery as a mindset, as a way of shifting our perspective to look at the design problems differently. And really, it's not just one mindset, it's these kind of 6 mindsets working together, these 6 different ways of interpreting the world and acting upon that information. It's these 6 mindsets that really help us kind of embrace that spirit of discovery, which is to learn something new, try and perceive the problem in a new way, and try and recommend solutions that have not yet been tried before. These mindsets are aspirational. I understand that they might be uncomfortable. I've been doing this 30 years, and these still feel uncomfortable for me. You might look at them and say, well, I do that, but then you think there's that one. I can't achieve that. That's hard for me. And that's why I've given you these behaviors. Mindsets translate perceptions into actions. And sometimes we can act in a way without necessarily having that perception or that understanding. Because mindsets are embodied in behaviors. We do the things that reflect our perceptions. And sometimes, like I said, you can do those things without necessarily having that perception and that understanding first, to kind of try something new. I've given you these prompts because they can help short-circuit your instincts, right? Your instinct might be to try and be the expert in the room, right? And to quash your curiosity. It might be, your instinct might be to accept all assumptions at face value because it's non-confrontational and you don't want to get into an argument with someone. But you can do these things to try and embrace that skepticism. And you might be afraid to appear humble because it implies a certain amount of ignorance, right? And implies a certain amount of lack of experience that can be difficult in some work situations. And my hope is that you can embrace some of these behaviors to try and cultivate these mindsets in yourself. My work here is done. Thank you very much for your time.